Did you miss me? Welcome back to the channel, everyone, and welcome to 2023. We're starting 2023 off with a new build because if you've been following the channel for a while, you know I always have a build going on. You may hear a little stuffiness in my voice. You know, we're dealing with the common sickness going around this time of year, but to get to the build, we took last week off to enjoy the holidays. Didn't see a video last week, but in that downtime, I was busy working on a new project. This has been in the works for a while. I've been wanting to build something like this for a very long time. Just didn't really know where to start and knew there was a lot of parts to it. I wanted to kind of do some research and do it right. As you might have seen by the thumbnail and title, this is gonna be a slammed RC build or a lowrider, show truck, whatever you'd like to call it. As some of you may know from some of my other videos, I'm pretty big into going to car shows as well as RC and many other hobbies, full-size car shows, and I thought it would be pretty cool for the time being to have an RC car to bring to those shows that I could drive around and slam it on the ground right next to another full-size build. Thought it would be pretty sweet to bring out there. And I knew right away to do what I wanted to do, I couldn't start with a lexan body like we normally do in RC. I needed a hard body, something made out of styrene or another plastic. Many people will recognize this body. This is the K5 Blazer from RC4WD Drive. There's a bunch of builds just like mine based off of this body already. It's the most readily available, solid, hard body that you can find. It's really detailed. You can see I started adding a couple of little pieces to it here and there. I needed to get some dimensions and how much room I had while designing the chassis. Speaking of designing the chassis, that's what I've been up to for the past week. I have hours and hours of design work already into this chassis. We're gonna start building it today. Well, mocking it up anyway. Let's get a little closer in and we can talk about what's going on here. So what I started with was an Axial SCX-10 chassis. I believe this one came from a base camp model. I just went on eBay and picked up a used chassis. I wanted all of the parts like the cross members and links and all of that kind of stuff just to help me design. I may be able to use those links in the build, that kind of stuff. So I didn't want to just buy frame rails. I started off with that and modeled the frame rails into Fusion 360. That way I could start designing pieces around it. To start off with the front, I knew we wasn't going to be using a solid axle. We were going to be going with independent suspension up front with lower control arms. So first thing first, I had to design a cross member. You can see here I have a test piece printed out. I also picked up a new toy tool, whatever you want to call it, for this build, printing out some of these pieces with the fine details as well as just the overall shape of them. Would have been really hard to do on my 3D printer. I have an Ender 3, so I decided it was time for me to jump into the world of resin printing or SLA printing. I picked up the Elegoo Saturn 2. It was on sale for the holidays and it's been working really well so far. We'll get more into some of the prints and some things I've been running into it as we start building the front end of this chassis. This is one of the first prints. You can still see some of the support marks on it. This is just a test print just to mock up my front end design. To start putting this together and mocking it up, we're gonna get these rear sections of the chassis out of the way. These will be cut and back halved in another video. Basically, everything from here on back will be cut, but that'll be in its own separate video. Today, we're focusing on mocking up the front. Everything on the front was designed around using the SCX-10 frame, as well as mini E-Revo shocks, and for now, the hubs off of an AR44 SCX-10 axle. These are the steering hubs for the front. For now, I'm using these. I may decide to just design my own for the final build, but just as a placeholder for now, this is what I'm using. The first part to design was a lower control arm. This is where I started learning the intricacies of the printer. I didn't want to use just a screw going through the lower control arm, so I actually went with a hinge pin design. This will actually use a pin that I still need to cut down, but the pin will fit inside the arm. As you can see, the first thing I'm learning with the printer is tolerances. This printer has different tolerances than my old Ender 3, so it's something I have to learn This is just the first test print, so we won't be using these today. But just so you know, the hinge pin will sit inside the arm. And if you can see, there's a tiny hole right next to the hinge pin hole. And this will hold another screw that'll capture that pin in the arm and not let it fall out. Another thing that resin printing is helping us with that I do not believe I would be able to get something this small and accurate out of my Ender 3. These arms, after printing, just take a small section of threaded rod, and then I can screw on a rod in on the end. And like I mentioned, for today we're going to use a screw just to pass through where the hinge pin is going to go, just to mock this up. I drilled out the back of the arm just so that I could screw in this bolt. Up top is very similar. We have another rod end, but instead of a complete lower arm, this is just another printed rod end of sort, you could say. And this will pivot at the top here, just on this bolt. I'm not quite sure just yet if I want to make the hole smaller where the bolt threads into the mounts, or if I want to keep this nut on the back side. Kind of like the idea of the nut as it stays secure. Like I mentioned, the hub is just going to bolt directly to my rod ends. We're going to run a screw through and just put a nut on the back side. All right, so now we have a working control arm, we have a hub, but how are we going to mount the shock? How is this suspension going to work? Before we can actually mount the shock though, we need to install one more piece to get that slammed look. I'm sure a lot of you have seen this idea before. It's nothing new or revolutionary, but I'll be using servos to move the shocks up and down. Essentially, the truck will be sitting at ride height around here, and then whenever I want to park it, I will activate the servos and the suspension will travel up, slamming the frame on the ground. To do that, I'm using a pivot, a cantilever to mount the shock to. It'll mount to the front of my cross member here and move the shock up and down. This one as well still has a lot of support marks on it, but keep in mind, this is only a test print. This is only for mock-up. You may be wondering why I'm using a lot of this as just mock-up pieces. And well, for one, as you can see here, I'm having to drill out this hole for the screw to fit. I'm learning the tolerances on this printer, so not quite sure how some things are gonna fit just yet. So I need to mock them up first, do some test prints, and see how things fit before I print the final parts. But as well, you may be hearing here, or maybe you see it on some of the parts, and yep, there it goes, it just cracked off. I figured out pretty quickly that for what I want to do, I purchased the wrong resin to start off with. This resin is fine for printing little miniature models and stuff like that, but for mechanical parts, things that we'll see not like abuse, but a little bit of movement and things that needed to be threaded into and whatnot, this standard type resin is very brittle. It's not too good for this kind of stuff. Part of learning, I did find out that there is an ABS like resin, and I have some on the way. That's what we'll be printing the final parts out of. Hopefully that'll be a good bit stronger, but for now, until that comes in, I'm printing everything with the standard resin that I have now just to mock it up. To finish mocking this up, I'm actually just gonna glue this piece back on and we'll put that screw in. It's just a pivot point for the cantilever arm. Hopefully that ABS resin does hold together better and it will look better than this, but we can now see that our pivot is installed. We can now install the shock. I have one hole in the bottom of the control arm here that the shock bolts to, as well as up here in our cantilever. So knowing what I'm dealing with these parts will be pretty fragile here, but you can see now we have a cantilever that allows the shock to travel up and down, which allows our suspension to travel up and down. Gives me a good, probably I'd say 1/2 inch to 1 inch of travel, which at this scale will be enough. The truck will ride pretty close to the ground already, as you can see by the lower control arm position, all the way maxed out. But when we slam it on the ground, that chassis will lay flat on the ground. Hopefully you can see that better in the 3D model if you can't see it in the mock-up I have here. To actuate this suspension, I'll be using these micro servos. I will have 2 mounted to the front here to work the cantilevers. I actually did 3D print one of the servo mounts already, and it will bolt up here to the front of the chassis, but I used the wrong servo model in Fusion 360 when modeling these mounts, so the servos don't actually fit in the mounts that I printed. I already fixed that in the design, but I'm waiting till I get that new resin in to reprint them. So they'll mount here, and the suspension will travel up and down. That completes one side of the front minus steering. As you can see in the Fusion 360 model, I have basically the whole entire chassis modeled. Everything ready, just have to print a whole bunch of parts and get a lot of print time in. The steering has been figured out there. We'll be using another servo on the front. We have the RC4WD drive scale single speed transmission that'll fit right between the frame rails. The back half of the chassis will be back halved. I'll have to create a hump. That way the axle can travel up. I will be using an AR44 axle that, as you can see, I've already begun cutting up. I have to narrow it down for the wheels and tires that I'm gonna use. That way those wheels tuck nice up into that body. I have some tires on the way, and we'll likely be doing some completely custom 3D printed wheels. And hopefully when it's all said and done, we'll have a pretty sick looking truck. Body mounted there, slammed on the ground, giving us a nice clean look. I'm planning on going all out with this one, from wheels to interior. Inside the bed, we'll definitely have to do some cutting to fit those frame rails and that suspension back there. Paint wise, I want this thing to look super scale and be a really sweet build. Definitely a change of pace from going fast with all of the no prep and drag racing stuff, but this should be a pretty sweet little truck when it's all said and done. I'm really excited getting to get back into modeling parts and doing a complete custom chassis like this. Let me know down in the comments below what you think about the build. If you want to see more of the process of modeling parts of the chassis, maybe something like when I get into modeling those wheels, if you want to see a video covering how I go through and model parts in Fusion 360, let me know down in the comments below. Leave a like if you enjoyed this video. If you're excited to see the rest of the build, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a video, and click on that bell icon to be notified whenever new videos go live. This isn't the only thing we have planned for 2023. I have some other projects in the works, and hopefully a year full of great videos for you guys. Thanks for all the support, and as always, thanks again for watching. Peace.